to our second in a series of 6 speaker series on the principles of nonviolence, living the principles. So we are talking about the 6 principles that sustained the civil rights movement, but in a modern day context. And we have 6 fantastic speakers. Hopefully you were able to catch the last one. My name is Julie Gallegos. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Habitat for Humanity of the St. Vrain Valley here in Longmont, Colorado. If you have probably heard Habitat for Humanity before, but if you don't know, we are an international organization that works in over 70 countries. And I wanted to just touch on our roots real quick. Habitat for Humanity started out of a farm in Georgia called Koinonia in the 1940s, and the idea was for people, black and white people, to work together on this farm, live together, get paid the same amount of money in the 1940s in Georgia. So this is where Habitat comes from, and our mission statement literally says brings people together, and that is what we're hoping to do today with this speaker series. So welcome. This is the second in a series of 6. We thank Longmont Public Media for doing the recording, getting this studio here. If you're interested in being part of the studio audience for the next series, you are welcome. You can sign up on Eventbrite and join us here in our studio. If you miss one, you can always go back and watch them. So if you missed Angel Sanchez from 2 weeks ago, you can go onto YouTube, either Habitat's YouTube, or you can go to Longmont Public Media and watch that. They are live streamed and recorded. We will have studio audience questions, and if you are watching online, you can also put your questions in the chat, and we will attempt to figure out how to get those as well when we do the question and answer after. There is also an added reception at Recovery Cafe, which is just right across the street, and they are kindly hosting us for a reception. So if you are part of our studio audience, you can walk across the street when we are done for some snacks and some further discussion. If you're watching online and you want to drive over to Recovery Cafe at 7:30, you can join us there as well. This series is brought to you by Habitat for Humanity and Central Presbyterian Church, but we are also supported by a whole bunch of organizations, including Longmont Public Media, the Executive Committee for African American Cultural Events, Longmont Multicultural Action Committee, El Comité, then Center for African American and African Studies at CU, I Have a Dream of Boulder County, Heart of Longmont Church, Bright Collaborative, Nepali Jatra, Asian Pacific Alliance of Longmont, Recovery Cafe, the Center for People with Disabilities, and as I mentioned, LPM. So we are here to talk about these principles because the goal of all of this is to build the beloved community. So Coretta Scott King, a civil rights icon and the wife of Martin Luther King Jr., said that the beloved community was a realistic vision of an achievable society, one in which problems and conflicts exist, but are resolved peacefully and without bitterness. It is a global vision rooted in a spirit of love and reconciliation. So the beloved community is something that we need to build. It is a future, but it's something that we have to do. We have to understand the principles that lead to that and commit to them. And we're going to talk about understanding, and understanding is not something that happens on its own. It's something that we all have to follow through and choose for ourselves and commit to build the beloved community. There are 6 different principles. The first one we talked about was courage. Tonight we're going to talk about friendship and understanding. And we're going to talk about justice, transformation, love, and finally hope. Practicing the beloved community principles of nonviolence can be almost an antidote to the news that you're reading. So coming here tonight is a way to fill your spirit and learn more about when you're watching the news. It's something that you can be doing to positively change where we are right now. So the second principle of nonviolence is that nonviolence seeks to win friendships and understanding. Because the beloved community, the outcome of practicing nonviolence, is redemption and reconciliation. So we're trying to bring people together. My example from the civil rights movement for you tonight is from the Montgomery bus boycotts, which everyone probably has heard of. You were taught in school about Rosa Parks, who, by the way, was supposed to be they keep saying an old lady. She was 42, so I take a little offense to old lady on that. But if you didn't know, Claudette Colvin and others actually came before her. And again, if you weren't aware, Rosa Parks was not a spontaneous choice that she gave up. This was a well-planned, well-thought-out strategy and to start off the bus boycott. But most importantly, the bus boycott lasted for 381 days. And in those 381 days, they had to figure out a new transportation system. So they did. They worked together. There were carpools. There were other things. People did end up having to walk. But there was an alternative to this. When I say all that, the goal wasn't, however, to just create a new system. So there could be a white Montgomery and a black Montgomery. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to bring back into reconciliation, into right relationship through understanding and building friendship. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And our speaker for tonight, if I could think of anyone in the city of Longmont who has done more for reconciliation and understanding in this community for the last 30 years, it would be our speaker tonight. In fact, I had a thing I was working on with my coach, my professional coach, and she said to think of a person that you would want to be like in your profession and your job. And our speaker tonight is the first person that came to my mind. So, without further ado, I'd like to present Carmen Ramirez, who was born in Texas, but calls Longmont home now. She worked for the city of Longmont and also the City of Boulder, and retired just a few years ago as the Director of Community and Neighborhood Resources. She is also a Rockefeller Foundation's NetGen Leadership Fellow. So please welcome Carmen Ramirez.
Thank you. That was really nice. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for joining us in the studio and online. As you can see from the gray hairs, I'm a little bit older, so usually I just speak, but I brought notes this time. So bear with me. I really want to thank everyone for engaging in this conversation. And I want you to consider and reflect on how understanding can build bridges and friendships that help strengthen a beloved community. And you're hearing all these amazing speakers. And Angel was our speaker last week or 2 weeks ago, and he was awesome. And it really warms my heart because, as Julie said, I've been in this community 35 years, and it is so great to see the next generation. I also talk with my hands, so if you see my hands going all over. Like I said, I've been in the community 35 years. I have a lot of stories, a lot of experiences, so I was trying to narrow it down. So I'm going to share a little bit about myself, my experiences, but more importantly, the hidden gems of Longmont. I think there are some amazing people in our community, and sometimes we don't see them. So I'm hoping that this conversation sparks curiosity, moves you to reflect, to learn more, to join the efforts of strengthening a beloved community in our backyard. I want to give you this acronym, YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. What if we said yes to in my backyard instead of no? So keep that one in your back pocket. But I also want you, as I'm talking and sharing stories, I'm going to ask you to think about some key things that help to build understanding and bridges in our community. So the first one is heart listening. Heart listening. The ability to truly listen with your heart is key to understanding others. Seeing to believe. Do we believe in humanity, people's values, empowerment? And then we can see the hidden gems in our community. History. History is really important because the importance of the past to understand the present and build a future. But we need to go back to history. And I often hear people say, well, didn't the civil rights take care of that? Or I had no idea that that's why it started. So I want to start with a quote from John Echo Hawk, who is the director of the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder. So here's his quote. My natural tendency is to listen first, to reflect on what people are saying, and to discern the meaning behind this. Then I can see the common ground and the unifying themes. Sometimes this makes Anglo people uncomfortable, but really listening is what I do first. You'll find this quote in a book that I have with me. It's called Salsa, Soul, and Spirit by Juana Bordas. It looks at the qualities of Latino, African American, and Native American leaders, highlighting their leadership qualities and cultural aspects, but all through an asset lens. That's another word to keep in mind. How do we treat folks as an asset? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. My family has been in Longmont for 35 years. My husband, jokingly, I'll say, he dragged me up here in 1991 from El Paso, Texas. My husband was hired by the Native American Rights Fund to be the editor and grant writer. NARF, as it's referred to, is a legal organization that defends the rights of tribes, and it's been doing it for over 50 years. And it's right in this community. And a lot of people don't even know that gem exists. And there are several other Native American organizations in the area that, again, people aren't aware of. They don't know that those gems in our community. I want to thank my husband and honor him for all the work that he's done in Native American communities. Because of him, I started this journey of listening, learning, and was able to meet some amazing people from various tribes. My husband will tell you that unless people understood the history of Native people, the genocide, and value of Native Americans, we could not move towards healing. And that's why history is important, because it'll help us in the future. If you think about who was here in the Front Range before the Chicago colony came to start Longmont, who were the stewards of this land, who was displaced and killed, think about current efforts today to welcome back and build relationships as we're doing with the Northern Arapaho. And if you don't know what are those relationships, you can look up Sister Cities, the work that the Senior Center has done with the Elder Exchange, and the harvesting of choke cherries. Those are all efforts present day that we're doing with Northern Arapaho. Because of my husband's work and relationship with Native American communities, I started to learn a history that was never taught in school. The injustices, the wisdom, strength within some of the Native American communities, but more importantly, how to further strengthen my ability to listen with my heart. Because in Native communities, listening is very important, and especially when elders are present. So I learned how to listen with my heart. The importance of reflection and relationship in communities. I also want to give thanks to my grandparents. So my grandparents were Juana Holguin and Antonio Gándara from El Paso, Texas. They came during the civil unrest in Mexico to El Paso, and that's where they made home. And my aunt, Concha Gándara, they've all passed, who provided a safe home and love when my parents couldn't. And they stepped in and they kept my brother and I out of the system. And I think grandparents, and in many cultures, that is not only a hidden gem, but a hidden safety that sometimes systems don't understand. They planted the seeds of understanding, listening, redemption, and reconciliation, along with cultural pride, strength, a strong work ethic, very strong work ethic, and what it meant to care for others. My grandparents' home, jokingly we used to say it was kind of like the UN. We had relatives from both sides of the border that would come, and they would stay. And then it would always be, there's always more frijoles, so we're okay. Because of them, I also learned to be an interpreter for the family. I was able to stay up late, this is really gonna age me, because I could interpret for my great-grandmother TV shows like Bonanza or Gunsmoke. And she would say, ¿Qué dijo el gordito? The little fat guy said this. And also when we went to places, I interpreted in different agencies or different stores. And it gave me an insight into systems and power and privilege, but also a little bit of sneaky strategy that would be useful later on in my community work. So for my husband, returning to Colorado was coming back home. He was born and raised in Fort Collins. I'm not going to tell you how long ago, but he knew racism up front, the impact of being seen as a deficit. He experienced not being able to go into stores that had white trade signs. That existed all along the Front Range. The schools that discouraged him from believing that he could go to college and encouraged him to focus on a trade or joining the military. That's what was happening. He was drafted and went to Vietnam. When he returned, he attended and graduated from CSU and was very involved in the Chicano and Native American movement. So I'm very proud of all of that because it also brought history and lessons for me. For me, I had never lived outside of El Paso, Texas, except for once. My father moved us to this place called Angleton, Texas. It was a very small town that had a railroad track, and there was 2 schools, and one was for the Mexicans and the blacks, and the other one was for whites. And my dad signed us up at the wrong school. So you can imagine it was a tough year because we were not welcomed. So clearly that when we saw those lines, it didn't take much for us to return back home to El Paso where we were safe. And if anybody, for those of you that don't know what a border town is like, El Paso, Texas is a border town. But I'm going to give you my definition of El Paso. It's a third world, but not the kind that you see as a deficit. It's where 2 worlds come together. There's languages, culture, there's food, there's family on both sides of the border. I can tell you how easily it was to walk across that river when it didn't have water. That was a long time ago. It's not the case today. I saw beauty where others saw deficit. My childhood and my youth had a lot of challenges. And I know what it was like to be seen as a deficit or not seen at all. What I did not know at the time was that some of these experiences would evolve into resiliency and skills that I would use later in my community work. I proudly say that I'm trilingual. I speak Spanish, English, and Spanglish. And every time I walked into a classroom to talk to kids, and there was a bunch of Chicanitos or Mexicanitos, and I said, okay, are we doing this in Spanish, English, or Spanglish? And their faces would light up, and they say, Spanglish, miss, let's do it in Spanglish. So if you hear a little Spanish and English, that's what I'm doing. But before we move on, I want you to think about language and the power of oppression as it relates to language. The power of oppression can be seen in the perception that one's native language must be erased and English is the only language. Think about Native Americans in the boarding schools. What was what they did? Removal of language, culture, identity. I want to tell you that when I went to the first grade, I spoke Spanish, and I think I also spoke English. But if they caught you speaking in Spanish, you would have to come to the front of the classroom, extend your hands, and the nun would hit you with a ruler. And they would tell you quickly that that language is your home language, and English is what you speak in the outside world. I think about that, and I think about a child walks in with a gift. He already has one language. Instead of saying, that's a beautiful gift, let's further develop it, and let's give you another language, that's not what immigrant children usually are told. But yet everybody else is told, learn another language, you'll be well-rounded, you'll have more opportunities. The difference in the messaging. And it's important to understanding because it helps you understand why individuals lost their language and are still perceived as a deficit. When we came to Longmont in 1991, we didn't get a very warm welcome, and unfortunately my kids were directly impacted. My daughter was in the 4th grade, and she spoke both Spanish and English. When we went for the first teacher conference, we were told, my husband and I, that generally Hispanic kids from Texas and Florida were placed in special ed automatically. Then the messaging began that she should only speak English. So soon she would lose the ability to speak Spanish. That was heartbreaking, not only because it happened to me, but because I had worked so hard to retain speaking Spanish. My daughter tells that story in a video that's in Local Lives under the Longmont Community Foundation. So I'm going to share resources. But it also kind of got me on this journey of beginning to see the Latino community and other communities of color within Longmont and Boulder County. And I knew the gems, but I knew others weren't seeing those gems. I could identify those gems, and those gems made me very warm, which was connecting to my community. I started working at the City of Boulder in the Housing Authority, organizing different housing sites, and it was a great opportunity to learn at the grassroots level, not only about the local communities, but how to navigate the systems within Boulder County. But more importantly, where I had opportunities to change systems and that could be more culturally competent and human-centered focused to better serve these communities. In 1998 to 2001, I started this amazing journey, and it's in part, well, it's all in part, or all because of my husband, who nominated me for the Rockefeller Next Generation Leadership Program. And for 2 years, we met with about 30 leaders from across the country. We gathered to discuss democracy in the US and visited various cities around the US and in South Africa. I used to tell people, I'm leaving for a long weekend and I'm going to Miami, and they're like, oh great, you're going to the beach. And I'm like, no, I'm locking ourselves in a conference room and we're gonna talk about democracy and racism, and they're like, why? Right, and so we did that for 2 years. We really stretched ourselves, we learned how to listen and understand, we developed our leadership skills. But more importantly, when we would visit these communities, we would meet with leaders from grassroots to grass tops. Again, practicing the listening and the learning, and learning about their history and seeing the power of what happens when communities are valued and seen as an asset. In San Antonio, there's the Guadalupe Center. The Guadalupe Center, and keep in mind this was 2001, was a cultural center that didn't just provide arts and crafts for the Latino community. It provided a safe space. It provided a place where people could be seen as artists or community members could be valued. And so we got to meet with them. We met with parents that were organizing, similar to a program that we have in Longmont called PI, Padres Involucrados en Educación, Parents Involved in Education, all the way up to city leaders. In South Africa, I got to go to the Desmond Tutu Peace Center and talk to them about the truth and reconciliation process, really visit with them. I'm surprised because I recently asked someone, I mentioned that I went to South Africa and I mentioned apartheid and they didn't know what apartheid was. They didn't know the significance of apartheid. We also went to Robben Island where Mandela was held as prisoner. And again, learning how to really listen to people, hear their history, and see how people, especially if you think of South Africa, I met with folks that had AIDS centers, Borders Without Doctors. So all of those experiences really helped, especially when I come back. So I want to give you another quote, and I unfortunately don't know the author of this, but on returning from South Africa, this became really important. We do not believe because we see because we believe. So I told you before that I always felt like the more and more I got to know Boulder County, I knew about these amazing gems in the community. And not everybody knew them or saw them. And that's where building bridges is really important. So I came back in 2001 from South Africa. I started working for the City of Longmont right after coming back from South Africa. I was hired in the Community Relations Division as a community specialist. I did mediation, conflict resolution, community building. But what was really important is the history of this division. It started as a recommendation from the U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Office. So the Department of Justice comes in and they make a recommendation that there should be a liaison between police and the Latino community. It's evolved and it's grown and it does amazing things. It's now Community and Neighborhood Resources. Angel actually works for that division, which also makes me very proud. But the Department of Justice had come in to review the shooting in 1980 of 2 young Latinos by police. This tragedy, led Latino leaders to come together and work for change. El Comité was one of the organizations that came out of that tragedy. So I think when we think of reconciliation and we think of apartheid and we think of the tragedy that happened, and coming back fresh from South Africa, that was the first thing that I asked the chief of police, like, have we ever done a reconciliation? And he's like, no. So then I realized I needed to be a little bit more strategic or sneaky. You choose. So one of the observations one of the recommendations from the Department of Justice was that Longmont did not celebrate their communities of color. There was no celebrations. And so it gave me an idea, and I contacted my good friend Glenda Robinson, who you're going to hear from in a couple weeks. And I started working with city staff, and we started a very small group of folks to honor Dr. King. We gathered at the Civic Center Plaza, freezing and passing a torch honoring Dr. King. It was a very small group. But that small group has continued to be committed, and it's evolved and embraced as a community celebration, which is held today at Silver Creek High School, which the students themselves, we did it the first year at Silver Creek, and we wanted to rotate from high school to high school, and the students were like, no, we want to keep it here. And they have just been really gracious and very involved, and they really do a great job. We also have Black History events that are held throughout February, and that's where Madeline Strong Woodley came along, and she helped to further that Later, Shakita Yarbrough, who's a former council person, who served on city council, started the Juneteenth celebration and helped the city adopt it as a holiday. So I think that that's why it's important to know history, because then you see the evolution of where change happens. So I want to share this other quote, and this quote is from Grace Lee Boggs. And if you don't know that name, please look it up. Look into Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs, community organizers. Grace Lee, Chinese American, James Boggs, African American. They were married, and they were amazing people that did great work in the civil rights. But their name isn't known very much. So Grace Lee Boggs says this: "We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness in this exquisitely connected world. It is never a question of critical mass. It's always about critical connections." And I begin to see how true that was. In 1998-99, I was part of a small group of Latino leaders. We started the Latino Taskforce. We did the first quality of life assessment of the Latino community, which was presented in 2001 to half of the workforce of the city of Longmont, so that they would understand the community was changing, the demographics were changing. Then we said, we need to go out to the community. For 3 Saturdays, we gathered 100 people and talked about the Latino community, but through an asset lens. We developed the Latino Strategic Plan, which focused on housing, education, culture, community, and economics, all through an asset lens. This helped to kind of jumpstart and leverage things like the Latino Chamber and other movements and projects. This now is a Longmont Multicultural Action Committee, because part of what happened is when we started doing things in the Latino community, other folks from communities of color would come up and say, "How'd you do that? Can we do that? Can we join you?" And it was like, of course, the bridge gets bigger and there's always room for more. And I think it's important that you know this history so that you understand how the movement started, celebrations or actions, but also how it evolved. And I think it's important for the next kind of succession of leaders to know that history and build on the success, or even to understand the challenges of those before them. So I think that's why history is important. One of the things that we started was called Inclusive Communities. And this was a celebration where we had all these different cultures, and they would bring food. And they would put out artifacts of their culture. The very first one that we had was held in the Civic Center. The reason we had that is because we felt at that time that the city leaders did not see our communities of color, the hidden gems. So we had tables and people made food, and the diversity was really very expansive. And it could be one person who was Iranian, or one lady who was of Sami descent, and would always ask, "Can you put me next to the Native American rights table, because we have so much to talk about," right? And she would make cookies and bring a reindeer hide, right, to share. And I remember the very first time, and all these people were filling the Civic Center. Maybe it was the second year. And we had the Peruvians there, we had the Tongans in. You should have seen when the Tongans walked in with a roasted pig. And I would work with getting city directors and city leaders and other leaders from the school district and from other organizations to come. And I actually had people that came up and they said, "Carmen, where'd you get all these people?" And I would say, "You don't see them." And they go, "Yeah, no, I don't see them." I'm like, "You don't see them." And the reason we did that was so that leaders could have an opportunity to interact with a community they didn't see, right? When the Tongans and the Peruvians were having a dance-off and nobody wanted to go into the city council meeting, because we did it right before city council meeting, city council said, you've grown too big, you need to move. We said, okay. So we moved to the senior center and then the museum, and unfortunately it got so big. But I think that was really important. If you think about when you go from table to table and you're tasting food, when your mouth is full, it forces you to listen. And it forces you to connect and appreciate in a very different way. When you're eating collard greens, or you're eating jeweled rice, or you're eating menudo, right? It gives you an appreciation, right? And it also fills your stomach, right? The other one I want to tell you about was Dia de los Muertos. Dia de los Muertos became the largest celebration in the state of Colorado. But if I ask people, do you know how it started or why it started? It started because Martha Clevenger, who was the director of the museum, came to me and a couple other Latinos and said, why don't Latinos come to the museum? And I looked at her and I said, well, I didn't know we were invited. And if you think about any place, how would you know you're welcomed? What would you see in that store that would you bring you in? Or how do you want to be treated? So we had this conversation with the community, and we had this conversation with the museum, and we said, let's start with Day of the Dead. And at that time, the museum used to be across the street in the old courthouse. So that was in the early 2000s. Gradually, it grew and it grew and it grew, and it became the largest celebration in the state of Colorado. Those successes happened by looking at maybe where there was division or oppression, or maybe where they didn't see the hidden gems of Longmont. And again, it always provided opportunity to meet and listen different people and to interact with people. But to do it in a positive light. You all know that when you go to your child's or your grandchild's or your nieces or nephews' play, they're also proud, right? And they're being highlighted in a very positive light. When we provide that opportunity to our communities, for them to come forward, and for these communities to really be able to share, and for folks to listen with their heart and to see them, it really changes the dynamics. It also changes how we understand. I can't tell you the number of times in different events, activities, where people have walked away and they said, I didn't know this. I now understand. I understand that person better, or that community better. And then you begin to open a door. As I said, I'm also a mediator and a facilitator. I've done different trainings, done trainings on racism with next generation leadership. In addition to the 2 years, I then spent an additional 18 months focusing on racism in the US. And again, would sit down in these rooms and review and have conversations about racism in the US. So I want to go back a little bit to the beginning and then go to some questions. I mentioned the 3 skills that I asked you to spot. Heart listening, the ability to truly listen with your heart. I think it's key to understanding. Seeing to believe. You really see the humanity and their value and empowerment. And it helps to find the hidden gems. History, why it's important for us to understand our past to build our future. That's what I wanted to share with folks. I have a lot of stories and I could go on, but I know we need to get to some question and answer, and I want to just start there.
So we learned from last time that it's important to have a microphone not for you all to be able to hear, but for the people who are listening online. So if you have a question, I will come around with the mic. Who has a question for Carmen?
Any question?
I grew up in San Antonio.
Ah.
And so Day of the Dead is a big deal. And I've taught death and dying for many years. And so I would have my students would make an altar each year in October. Can you tell me, how does Longmont celebrate Day of the Dead? What happens in that celebration timeframe? What could I look for that I could attend that would be celebrating that event, that cultural belief system, and to participate in it possibly in some way?
So the museum has community altars that are set up. And what I love about those community altars, and there's one person in particular, I'm going to give her a shout out, Patty Moreno, who does some amazing altars. So different folks will build altars. What the beauty of that is that you might think, well, it's just Latino families. We've had organizations that have honored youth that we've lost. We did that a number of years ago, youth that were gang involved. We had other cultures that will come and set up an altar. And those altars will be on display at the museum, I believe, about 2 weeks. But also the other thing that has happened is the downtown development has started to also celebrate Day of the Dead. And there's food booths, and there's entertainment, and there's vendors that are there. Very different than when I first went door to door in the early 2000s and tried to invite businesses to engage. Now they're open to it. Now they see the value of it, and they see how fun it is. We have different dancers that come and do that. So that happens end of October, first part of November. And I know at the Guadalupe Center in San Antonio, they did some really great work around Day of the Dead, as well as they have the Tejano Conjunto Festival every year, and that's been going on for over 40 years, and not much people even in San Antonio know about the Conjunto Festival, but it's a blast. Other questions? I see a hand.
Hello? I don't think it's on. Can you guys hear me? Oh, okay. Thank you, Carmen, so very much for just your wisdom, your experience, your love, your passion for community. You are somebody who I've looked up to my whole life, and I see the blessings that you and your family, your husband Ray, have done for our community. And I just wanted to see if you could provide some insight on just things that are happening currently within our communities around, the division. There's a lot of division amongst our Latino communities, our Chicano communities. There's a lot of different things happening, right? And it has impacted families and friends. And I do believe, what you said about the importance of listening. But just because of all the outside noise, social media, there's just it's difficult. And so I just wanted to see if you could share a little bit about how you see things and just what more we can do, if there are things that you're aware of, places that we can plug in to really just, try to address some of the things that are happening, because it just feels very broken right now.
Sonia, thank you for that question. And Sonia's another amazing young leader who I've known for a very long time. And again, those are the things that really warm my heart the older I get, to know that I can step back and there are amazing young people that are taking and moving action forward. And when we talk about, I think Julie mentioned earlier, none of this is easy. And listening can be very hard. I've been in situations where I've had to hear people really say some awful things. I facilitated for 6 weeks an immigrant dialogue with people that were undocumented to people that were clearly on the other side of the spectrum. And for 6 weeks we gathered and we talked about different things. On those small levels, it's really helpful. On the big national level, it's scary right now. I've been through this several times. I've been teaching Know Your Rights for a very long time. I've taught it in the jail. I taught it in the schools. And Know Your Rights right now feels like there isn't a respect for your rights. But it is also very important. And then I also have to believe that there are good people that care, and I'm seeing that in the community when people ask, what can I do? Where can I go? Can I get trained in Know Your Rights? Can I help with teaching English? Can I help with providing something? And that's where organizations like Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, El Comité, are doing a lot of that work. Right now I'm still doing Know Your Rights, and unfortunately a family preparedness. And that is really hard work, and it really can take a toll. And that's why I think it's important that we have to remember that we have to take care of ourselves, but as we're helping individuals, we should never, or I don't want to see myself as the savior of anybody. I am there to help, and they are the decision makers of their life. They are the decision makers of what they need to do, and I'm there to help. And then when I mentioned earlier about language, that's where I think history is important. But how do we make changes, and how do we stay with hope? In 2016, we did a study called Resiliencia Para Todos, Resiliency for All. There's a video on the Community and Neighborhood Resources website, as well as the full assessment. We looked at the resiliency of our monolingual Spanish speakers, our bilingual youth, and cultural brokers. Angel, Becky, Sonia, these are the cultural brokers that know these two worlds and have connections in these two worlds and know how to navigate systems in trying times and in better times. One of the recommendations out of there, when I talked about language and we talked about how some individuals are told to assimilate and forget your language, one of the recommendations were, or some of the conversations from some parents were like, I use my kid as an interpreter, but he's not valued, right? And I'm afraid he's losing his native language. Now, one of the recommendations was called a biliteracy seal. And I have a couple educators in the audience in case I get this wrong. But the biliteracy seal says that you're fluent in a second language. Doesn't have to be Spanish. It could be German, it could be French. But Spanish is probably really useful in this area. Both school districts adopted that and have implemented a biliteracy seal. And Sonia, I think right now what we have to do is we have to know that we've been here before and we are resilient and we have to take care of ourselves and our neighbors. And I think this conversation of what does it take to be a beloved community is really important because it is exhausting. It is heartbreaking when you have to sit with families that have been torn apart and oppressed. And you heard me earlier say that when I would go with my husband to Native communities and we would hear their stories and the history, if you have ever heard anybody tell their story about boarding schools, you know how horrible people can be. But you also see the resiliency. And I have to believe that that's where our hope is. The hope in the resiliency of our ancestors, ourselves, and the resiliency that we're passing on to that next generation. And I hope that what we're doing is getting better about being strategic and changing systems. And that's what I would say, but it is hard. So Mija, I don't know if that answered your question.
And I think that like what you're doing now, the storytelling and the sharing of the stories is so important. Because that's how we learn and grow, and especially with the younger generations. I feel like not until I started listening to my dad's immigrant story and him like sharing that and lifting that up, and then really like listening to my grandma's stories and her sharing the struggles. And that's something I think we all need to do, is encourage more story sharing, like storytelling of the challenges and how we came out of those challenges. And just thank you for doing that, because I think that's how we've been able to change minds and hearts, especially in this community. And the work that you've done is so valuable because, you know, my grandparents settled in Longmont in the late 1940s, and my mom was born and raised here, and they've, just like the stories you shared, they've lived through those. But instead of burying those stories, they would share those stories and wanted to take the language back. And so you see that happening through the generations, and I think that is really important. So thank you for sharing that.
I want to add one other little story real quickly to that point. During the Latino History Project, we were gathering stories, and I was part of that group. And we hired high school students and students from Front Range and from CU to interview people throughout Boulder County, in Longmont, in Lafayette, and hear their stories. And I remember that we were doing an interview with KGNU, and there was this young Latina from Guatemala. She's the first generation here. She's the first person, the immigrant, to come. And she was talking about how she had interviewed an elder, Chicano, who was talking about the Chicano movement. She had never heard that word. She didn't know what Chicano meant. She didn't know what the Chicano movement was. And this individual started telling the story. And she said, well, wait a minute. You face the same struggles I'm facing today. And that connection and that, I don't want to say if it's assurance, but that reality that others have suffered what I have suffered. But there have been changes, and I have someone I can go to that can relate to me, that understands. And some of those projects that we did, like the Latino History Project, Becky's working on another project for identifying the history as the places of Latinos. Do you know where Latinos congregated? Do you know what places were important? That is important to that next generation, to give them the hope of resiliency and the understanding of the challenges that we overcame. That understanding and building of bridges is so important, not only for our youth, but for other youth. We have done 4 exchanges with youth from Longmont and Northern Arapahoes. Those exchanges have built relationship and friendships, but an understanding. For you to go to the reservation and see the beauty of the reservation versus the stereotypes that you might have heard, or the one day that they decide to teach about Native Americans, right, in the schools. That interaction for our next generation in understanding history, like I said, someone didn't know what apartheid was, is so important. And I have to say, not just for our youth, but when we started the elder exchange, we had elders from Northern Arapahoe come down for the March powwow, and they went with seniors from the senior center. If you think about it, someone asked me, what's the difference between the youth and the elders? And I said, the proximity to the boarding schools. These elders that are coming down, right, they probably have a lot more closer or themselves experienced boarding schools. And for elders for our community who maybe didn't know that history, never heard that, or knew the stereotypes, to be able to meet someone and hear directly and listen with your heart and see those individuals, that those connections really can offer a lot of strength and resiliency, but more importantly, esperanza, hope.
One more question here.
Well, Carmen, thank you for being here. I don't know if you're a hidden gem in Longmont, because I think everybody knows who you are, but you certainly are a gem here in Longmont, and so thank you for coming today and sharing some of that shine with all of us. My question has to do with cultural misappropriation. I am a pastor in a church, and almost every year in October, somebody says, hey, we should do a Day of the Dead altar. So we've done some of the tours of the altars. We've done things, going to the museum, things like that. And there's other things, Cinco de Mayo, there's other things. So at what point does listening and learning and appreciating become cultural misappropriation? And do you have like guidelines, recommendations? How can we be more self-aware in our enthusiasm?
That's a great question, and I would say we have to start with ourselves individually. A number of years ago, I had a young man that came in and was interviewing me and asking me about culture. And I said, what's your culture? And he said, I don't know, I'm white. And I said, what's your background? What's your cultural background? He said, I eat hamburgers and hot dogs. I said, where did you come from? And so I think that has to start, because Day of the Dead, almost every culture has some sort of ceremony or belief around death, right? And how they celebrate it. Or how they honor it, right? And so I ask people to start with themselves and start by looking at, what are your roots? Where do you come from, right? And what do you know? And if you don't know, learn. When you begin to misappropriate things is when you begin to make assumptions or feel the freedom that you can take over. The easiest one is you look at Halloween costumes and how disrespectful those can be towards Native Americans or Mexicanos, right? And they say, well, it's all in fun, right? There used to be a time where blackface was accepted. It is not today, and we understand why. And so I think you start with yourself, you start looking at those cultures, and then you understand how to honor cultures without appropriating, right? And that's taking without asking permission, that's taking without having that community in the center. When you're in front of people versus having that community be up front, that's that appropriation, because all of a sudden you've deemed that you're the one that has the knowledge. And so I ask people to think about those things. And I will tell you that these conversations aren't easy. And sometimes I'm met with microaggressions or flat out aggressions. I've dealt with those, especially when we've had immigration forums. I've met people get in my face back a few years back. But I've also had people, I had an incident once or a situation once where a teacher came up to me and she says, oh, I love the Mexican culture. You guys are just so family oriented and you work so hard. But why don't you value education? And I'm like, okay. And I said, why are you saying that? She said, well, you leave, the students, they leave and they go back home for a month or 2 months. And in this particular school, the teachers were very excited about a young man, one of the students, who was going to go to Europe. And he was going to be gone, I think, a month or 8 weeks. And they were planning his ability to make up his work by where he was going. We're going to go to England. You need to see this museum. You can go to this college and write a paper on that. But yet they were asking me why we, Mexicanos, did not value education, and that our children left and would come back, a month or 6 weeks later. And I said, Mexico has museums. It has culture. There's great archaeological sites. I think the Mayans and the Incas probably invented some stuff that you guys are using today, right? That's where I think that appropriation and bias kind of comes forward. But then the ability, and I'm going to say this because we didn't talk too much about redemption and reconciliation, and that's the importance of history, is I think we also have to own things when we're wrong. I think we have to own the history, and we have to acknowledge it in order to really understand and to be able to move forward and to know, how do I help within that.
Awesome. So thank you so much. We are perfectly at an hour. So look at that. So thank you.